Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 21, Section 5, Environmentalism. So here we go. The origins of environmentalism. Letter A, what was the accomplishment of the Environmental Defense Fund of 1972? And that was to ban the use of DDT pesticides. DDT was a pesticide used on a lot of produce, particularly apples. And the goal here would be to get rid of, obviously, worms and things of that nature. But by the time we get to 1972, there is kind of a link between DDT and cancer. And so there were obviously people out there that wanted to see DDT banned in the United States. And eventually it would be. Letter B. What became one of the most controversial and powerful books of the 1960s? And that was the work of Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring. Rachel Carlson had been a chemist, had been a researcher, and she kind of knew that there was a kind of a link between the chemical industry and certain forms of, I guess you could say, deaths among birds because of exposure to certain chemicals. So how did the chemical industry react to Rachel Carson's book or her arguments? Many of them were obviously outraged. They began an intense campaign against the book. What's interesting is, as Carson is kind of fighting this, she's also fighting cancer. And some of that was because of exposure to some of the chemicals that she had been working with when she was a chemist. Letter D, when did the first Earth Day, when was it? And then what was it devoted to? And the first Earth Day began in April of 1970, and obviously it was addressing environmental concerns, trying to get people to think about clean water, clean air, pollution issues. All those kind of things were brought up during that. And for the most part, we've been celebrating Earth Day since 1970, so we're getting closer to 50 years of celebrating that in our country. Letter E, what was the purpose of the Natural Resource Defense Council, or sometimes known as the NRDC? And it was to coordinate a network of scientists, lawyers, activists working on environmental concerns. They are still readily active yet to this day. Roman numeral 2, the environmental movement blossoms. What was the role of the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA? This was something that was actually formed under the Nixon administration. And the EPA was set up to enforce pollution standards, promote research, and directed anti-pollution activities. The EPA, I think, originally was targeting industrial manufacturers. So one of the things that they kind of fought for was obviously cleaner water that might be near some of these different chemical and power plants. Eventually, they're going to be fighting for cleaner air standards. The EPA is still around, and it has a lot of power. Today, you would probably see a lot of EPA regulations geared towards agriculture. Particularly when we talk about emissions from agricultural equipment, when we talk about emissions from livestock facilities, all that is regulated by the EPA yet to this day. Letter B, what were the goals of the Clean Air Act of 1970? And the goals of this was to establish emission controls on factories and cars. Many factories did not use scrubbers, which were located on a lot of the smokestacks. Today, those scrubbers are able to, I guess you could say, filter out some of the impurities so they don't go back into the atmosphere. When you talk about car emissions, we're going to try to raise the standards. Some states have obviously higher clean air standards than others. California has some of the most strict of the clean air standards, and part of that is because of their population. There are far more cars and people that live in California than they perhaps live in the Midwest. Letter C, Where was one of the most powerful displays of community activism in the country in the 1970s, and that was at a place called Love Canal. Love Canal was located not very far from Niagara Falls, New York, and pictured below are some images from that event. You can see kind of on the right bottom picture there. It looks like a kind of a sky shot of a lot of houses. In the middle there is kind of like looks like a trench, and that is the old Love Canal. It was a canal that was constructed probably in the mid 19th century, and as industry kind of bloomed, kind of in the Industrial Revolution days, that canal became contaminated with all sorts of toxic residue and such. And over time, the canal itself was filled in with fill dirt and such. And eventually, houses were built kind of on top of it. What was happening is that people that were living near these new homes, their children were getting sick. They were coming down with some different forms of cancer. For example, childhood leukemia was very common. And what they found out is it was what was in their backyards. The canal itself had contaminated the dirt and the groundwater and such, and it was making people sick. So to fight back, these housewives and property owners, at times would challenge inspectors, challenge the federal government. There was an incident where some housewives actually took some environmental inspectors hostage to get some attention here and to bring attention to the cause. What happens is that many of these property owners are going to be bought out, and they're going to be given kind of like the market value of their properties, and no one has moved back. Because this is still a very, very dangerous site. But what's interesting is since the early 1970s, more of these sites have been found throughout the United States. And we've had times when property owners, citizens, are fighting governments at the local and in some cases state level, trying to get compensation for their losses. Letter D, what source of electricity did a number of citizens become concerned about in the 1970s? And that was nuclear energy. Nuclear energy had been once touted as the clean alternative to things like coal. And throughout the nation, there were many power plants that were built in Nebraska. We have had 3 nuclear power facilities in our history. One that was located south of Lincoln for a very short period of time. It was in operation. The other 2 facilities, one at Fort Calhoun, which the Omaha Public Power District has actually taken offline, meaning that it's no longer in operation, but yet the facility still has nuclear rods that it still has to be responsible for. And the other facility that is still in operation is Cooper Nuclear, which is south of Brownville, Nebraska, kind of north of Falls City. So in letter E, why was nuclear energy thought to be better than fossil fuels? It was believed that it would be cleaner and it was less expensive. And hence, a lot of people thought it was the way of the future. So in letter F, what was the result of an incident that occurred at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Facility in Pennsylvania? 3 Mile Island is located very close to the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is their capital, the state capital of Pennsylvania. And there had been a leak of radiation, a low-level radiation leak, where the reactor, somebody had flipped the switch, and typically in a nuclear reactor, you use water to cool the power rods, and somebody had accidentally flipped the switch and drained the water, causing the rods to become very, very hot and allowing radiation to escape. The mistake was found relatively fast, and water was pumped back into that facility, and for the most part, it was stabilized. Nobody was killed, no one was hurt, but in 1986, there was an event in Chernobyl, which is in the Ukraine, where a facility actually blew up as a result of these power rods becoming very, very hot. And many people were killed there. And even to this day, this is kind of like a no man's land because of the amount of radiation that had escaped. There are still people that are being diagnosed with cancers that are related to the event at Chernobyl back in the mid 1980s. Thank you very much.